So thank you for joining us, and can I welcome our speaker?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here this evening, and thank you for being here to listen to me on what is, I think, probably the coldest night of the winter so far. I do lots of Brexit events, and I have one piece of paper, and I can stretch this to 45 minutes if I need to, but I can also condense it to 10. So what I propose to do is to condense it to 10, and then take your questions. And you don't have to ask me questions about what I say. I will try and answer anything that you put to me. I won't always know the answer, but I will do my best. So, the referendum and its aftermath. Let's go back to the 23rd of June, the day of the referendum. As you all know, the United Kingdom voted by a margin of 52% to 48% to leave the European Union. On the following day, the European Union institutions, and there are three institutions, the Parliament, the Council of Ministers representing the Member States, and the Commission, made a statement. And essentially that statement encapsulates the position that they have taken ever since. It's quite surprising the degree to which a position taken in the heat and the emotion of the day after has actually stood the test of nearly 6 months. We are 6 months almost down the road from the referendum. And essentially, they said three things. They said, first of all, that they very much regretted the outcome of the referendum. Naturally, I think it was made clear during the campaign, the Commission, the Parliament, the other Member States wanted the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union. They thought that British membership had been of benefit to the UK, but also of great benefit to the European Union. So regret, sadness, but resignation as well. It was clear that from the European Union's point of view, the decision was definitive, and they asked for the United Kingdom to act upon it as quickly as possible. And certainly on the 24th of June, I think the other member states wanted to get on with the business of negotiating withdrawal as quickly as possible. Hence the insistence in those early statements on rapid notification. I think since then, there has been a step backwards. People have realised that actually for an orderly and well-run negotiation, it is better for both sides to take the time to prepare their position. So there is less insistence on a rapid notification. We know from the Prime Minister that this is going to happen before the end of March, and I think the Member States, the Commission, the Parliament understand that that period of preparation has probably been necessary and inevitable. So that's the first principle. Sorrow, we can come back as well probably to the fact there was more than sorrow, there was also anger, shock, resentment, but essentially sorrow, but acceptance of the outcome. The second principle was that the treaty has, since it was amended by the Lisbon Treaty, laid down a procedure for a member state to withdraw from the European Union. Article 50. Everybody's heard of Article 50 now. There's one article of the treaty that everyone in this country has probably heard of. It's Article 50, which is somewhat ironic considering many people perhaps hadn't studied the treaty beforehand. What the member states have said, and they have stuck to this. Interestingly, I was looking at the press conference between the Prime Minister, Theresa May, and the Polish Prime Minister, and even there you can see that the Polish Prime Minister is sticking to this principle: no negotiation without notification. So until the process is formally started by the United Kingdom, giving its notice of withdrawal, the other member states will not negotiate. And that unity, that discipline, has, I think, to the surprise of some commentators, remained in place for these 5.5 months. It's obviously in the interest of the United Kingdom to try and peel one member state, another member state, off to play, as has been the tradition in British foreign policy, the different European powers off against each other. So far, it seems to me they have not succeeded in doing that. So that's the second principle. Only when the notice is formally on the table will the procedure start to organise the withdrawal. And the third principle is that in the view of the 27 member states, the best relationship any European country can have with the European Union is to be a member of it. Anything other than membership is of necessity suboptimal in that sense. You have to remember that the United Kingdom's membership was, in many respects anyway, custom-made. They had an opt-out from the euro, a permanent opt-out from the euro. The UK has a permanent, has an opt-out from Schengen, and it has a relationship with Justice and Home Affairs, which allows it to opt in to those measures it thinks are useful and to stay out of other measures. So it had a pretty flexible form of membership of the European Union before the referendum. But what the other member states are saying is membership is a package of rights and obligations, and that package is, particularly in relation to the single market, indivisible. You can't pick and choose. And I think if you listen to representatives of other member states, you listen to representatives of the Commission, there is, though it's not always reported in this way, there's no sense of vindictiveness, there's no sense of wanting to retaliate or to punish the United Kingdom. There is just an observation which in their view is an objectively correct, factually based observation that any other relationship is not going to be as good as being a member of the European Union. So that's what the three institutions have said, the three principles. Just very briefly, Article 50. So, as I say, most people have an idea of what Article 50 says. Just to run through it, it says the withdrawing member state must give notice in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. Now, the fact that the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution somewhat complicates the matters. We're still arguing about what our constitutional requirements might be. Next week, the Supreme Court will hear an appeal from the decision of the High Court, which concluded that constitutionally the decision must be taken by Parliament and not by the government exercising the Crown privilege, executive privilege. If the Supreme Court upholds the judgment of the High Court, in London most lawyers seem to expect that it will, then there will have to be a bill placed before Parliament. I think what the government is planning is a minimalist bill, a 3-line bill, to try and make it difficult to amend. And they will try and take that through Parliament as quickly as possible in order to retain the deadline of the end of March for notification under Article 50. We can come back to what might happen in Parliament later, if there's a question. Once notification is given, the next step is for the other member states, the EU 27, and I really want to emphasise this is going to be an intergovernmental negotiation. The Parliament will have a say, the Commission will have a role, but the onus, at least initially, will be on the other 27 member states. They will have to appoint a negotiator. It is likely that the negotiator will be someone within the Commission, probably Michel Barnier, but not necessarily Michel Barnier. Why the Commission? It doesn't have to be the Commission. The way the article is phrased makes reference to trade negotiations, where the Commission is always the negotiator for the European Union. They could have chosen to do it differently. I don't think they will for two reasons. One is the enormous complexity of these negotiations. They need the resources of the Commission to crunch the numbers, to work out the technical details. But the other is more political. And I think it's a determination of the 27 to sort of ring fence the Brexit negotiations, not to allow Brexit to dominate the European Union for the next 2 to 3 years. The European Union has a lot of other things to do, a lot of other crises and problems to address, and there is a message here about Brexit not being central to the story of the European Union for the 2 to 3 years to come. So the 27 appoint a negotiator, and eventually, within 2 years, a withdrawal agreement is reached. That agreement is reached on the basis of qualified majority voting of the 27. You have a negotiation where the 27 are in one room and the United Kingdom is in another. There will be discussions going on about withdrawal at which the United Kingdom will not be present. Qualified majority voting of the 27, approval by the European Parliament. And I think it's now recognised on the basis of experience with trade negotiations. You can't just conclude an agreement, hand it to the European Parliament at the end of the process and hope that the European Parliament will rubber stamp it. So I think in reality the Parliament will be kept closely informed of the progress of negotiations. The Article 50 agreement is essentially the divorce. I always use the term divorce until somebody said, well, actually it's more like separating Siamese twins, but I think we'll stick with divorce. And like most divorces, a lot of it will be about money. A lot of it will be about the respective financial liabilities. Which beneficiaries in the United Kingdom can continue to receive funds? So, when does the Common Agricultural Policy stop paying out to British farmers? What about contracts, grants signed under the structural funds? How long will they continue? There's a whole load of financial issues to resolve. Then there are things like the agencies which are present in the UK. We have the Medicines Agency, we have the European Banking Authority. They will obviously go somewhere else. And then probably most importantly, there is the issue of people, individuals and businesses who have taken advantage of their rights under the treaty to move and to set up work, businesses, lives in another member state. Something will have to be done to address their continuing rights. And again, we can come back to that because obviously it's a subject of much discussion. Article 50 itself says that the withdrawal agreement shall take into account the framework of future relations between the withdrawing member state and the European Union. So it has to be concluded in contemplation of whatever relationship is going to be put in place of membership. Whether it's a free trade agreement, whether it's a return to WTO rules. At that point, you're going to need to know where the end point is, where the relationship between the EU and the UK is going to land. But almost certainly, and this has been discussed a great deal in the press recently, to get from the date of withdrawal to the final long-term, steady-state relationship, you will need some kind of bridging mechanism, some kind of interim arrangements, some kind of transitional agreement. And it's that which I think, at the moment, a lot of government attention is focused upon. Clearly there are different views. Mark Carney thinks the obvious arrangement is to remain within the European Economic Area, or something like the European Economic Area for 2 or 3 years while you sorted out what he, I think, would like to see, namely a free trade agreement. But even if you're going to end up with WTO rules, they don't sort of spring back into life immediately that the UK leaves the European Union. There is even there a negotiation which will have to go on between the UK and the 138 members of the World Trade Organization. The UK will have to schedule commitments, It will have to extract its own tariff-free quotas from those which currently the European Union has scheduled in the WTO. So there's a negotiating, on the one hand, with the European Union to remove the UK quotas from the European Union's quotas, and on the other, with all WTO members, to table those as the UK commitment. And all 132 members get to have their say about it. It's not a kind of unilateral act. So there are lots of problems, lots of issues. I think what Lord Hill, the former British Commissioner, said at a breakfast last week is actually possibly the kind of the root, the main challenge at the moment, and that is to get both the United Kingdom, the other member states, the other institutions, into a space, and he sort of describes it as a psychological, emotional, mental space, but into a place where this discussion can be had in measured, reasonable, objective terms, where both parties can reach an arrangement which is not necessarily win-win. If you talk to anybody in Brussels and the other member states, they will say, this is already lose-lose. The European Union is going to lose, the UK is going to lose. But what can be done is to try and minimise the damage. And I think it's going to take quite a lot of manoeuvring to get people into that space. But when they do, we must hope for the best possible outcome for both sides. I think that was more than 10 minutes.
I think that raised quite a lot of questions, which actually we've got a few questions that have been put into the box as we asked at the start, but several people said they wanted to actually hear the conversation before opening up the debate to their questions. So what I might do is actually get the people who have put questions in to actually ask you their questions themselves, and then we'll follow on with some of the others. Taking off the top of the page here. Richard?
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering, what do you think the UK's vision might be, or approach, post-Brexit on regional investment? Do you think that there will be possibilities of the UK continuing to receive certain funds, or is it more likely the government making commitments to guarantee certain funds like they have with, for instance, support to student institutions? So really it's about how do you think the regional investment funding will pan out over the next few years?
Well, I think the first thing I should say in answer to any question about how things might pan out is that the onus is upon the United Kingdom, first of all, to set out its vision of what it would like, and then the others will respond to that. In terms of regional funding, it seems to me that if you look at the reasons why people supposedly voted to leave, the analysis of government identifies three things. Free movement of persons, stroke immigration. Sovereignty, control of the European Court, and both of those have been mentioned by the Prime Minister. They figured very strongly, for example, in her address to the Conservative Party conference. So they are red lines, we can assume. The third thing was the European budget. Now, I have yet to hear the Prime Minister absolutely rule out continuing to pay money into the European budget. And I think there is some scope for pay-per-play type arrangements, particularly probably in relation to Horizon 2020, which is the research programme, where we know that the UK does very well because it's competitive funding, so it's not allocated in advance. There is a call for proposals. British universities are very good at putting proposals together. They either come first or second in terms of the amount they reap from Horizon 2020. 2020. When it comes to regional policy, I think, well, there are alternate ways of looking at this. The European Economic Area arrangement, Norway pays into the community budget an amount to cover cohesion, in other words, fiscal transfers to the poorer parts of the European Union. So that model includes participation in the structural funds. I don't think Norway gets anything out of the structural funds. I don't think any of its regions are poor enough to qualify. And my guess would be, but this is speculation about the British government, which is not at all within my job, that they won't want to continue to participate in the regional funds. One of the arguments of the leavers was always, this is our money. We send it to Brussels, they add a layer of bureaucracy, and it comes back to us. And that, I think, in the current political climate, has a certain force. Having said that, but again, this is a comment on the British political scene rather than EU-UK relations. I was at the CBI a week ago when Theresa May made her speech. And one of the things that I picked up very much was she has a commitment to industrial strategy. There's a new industrial strategy. Now, how strong that commitment is, how long it survives the vicissitudes of political life, I don't know. But part of it is very much regional as well, ensuring that economic growth, economic development takes place outside London and the southeast. So it seems to me there is a chance that as part of the industrial strategy, there will be a commitment to regional development. I would say the one thing that people liked about the regional fund and social funds was the long-term planning, that you would get a commitment to fund over 5 or 7 years, so you weren't dependent on change of central government or a change of policy. Whether they can replicate that or not, I don't know.
Thank you for that. The next question, somebody's being shy. They haven't put their name, so I'll read out the question, which is, in its simplest format, what is the best stroke worst case scenario for small businesses in terms of Brexit?
The best case scenario, I think, is membership of the single market. This is somebody who worked in the single market for 15 to 20 years saying this. I know, again, one of the arguments of the leavers during the campaign was, why do small businesses have to bear the entire burden of all this red tape that emerges from the single market when they don't export? Only 5 or 8% of businesses, depends how you count, export. So why should the entirety of businesses be bound by the same rules? I think that misses 2 points. First of all, many small businesses are upstream, provide upstream inputs to bigger businesses. You know, if you're making widgets that go in Jaguar Land Rovers, you may not be exporting, but Jaguar Land Rover is, and JLR has to comply with the rules of the single market. And even if you're the sandwich maker outside the factory gates at Longbridge, you're dependent upon, obviously you're not exporting your sandwiches, but you're dependent upon people who do export. So even if there was no direct exporting, small businesses, it seemed to me, were dependent upon our access to the UK's access to the single market. Equally, you cannot imagine having different standards for the UK, different product standards, different technical standards for the UK from the rest of Europe. If you're producing toasters or vacuum cleaners or cars or whatever it is you're producing, it's very unlikely you'll have 2 production lines, one for the UK and one for the rest of the European Union. So it's much better to be in the European Union's single market, influencing the technical standards, than on the outside having to accept the technical standards as a commercial reality over which you have no say. So the best would be that. The worst would be the opposite of that, I think. Being outside the customs union means that some products sold by the UK to the European Union and vice versa would be subject to a customs duty. Customs duties would be very low for most things. Maybe not for foodstuffs, maybe not for one or two other products, but they wouldn't. They're not enormous. They're not likely to be very high tariffs between the EU and the UK. And I'm not sure that they would have a major commercial impact. However, what is much more significant in being outside the customs union is all the paperwork involved. At that CBI conference on Monday, before Theresa May spoke, the president of the CBI, Paul Dreschler, said, "What are we going to do if we're outside the customs union in 2 years' time? There is not a single port in the UK that can cope with all the paperwork that would have to go through those ports. We don't have the space, we don't have the holding room at the ports to hold the lorries whilst their documentation is being processed. We, businesses, don't have the warehousing because we would have to hold bigger stocks because we can't rely upon the flow of goods backwards and forwards without obstacles. We don't have those warehouses, we will have to acquire them, we will have to build them. That's an added cost. None of this can be done in 2 years' time." So that, again, I think is a problem for all businesses, large or small. Things like stock flow, which haven't really been thought about.
Thank you. George, do you want to ask your question? Or shall I read ahead?
What was it? There's a second referendum, right? There's been more chaos and confusion for businesses.
I don't believe in the prospect of a second referendum. I know that there is one political party, I can't remember, is it policy to have a second referendum? Yes. Okay, but it's discussed by one political party. I think there are voices within the Labour Party who espouse a second referendum. The Greens as well have sometimes talked about it. I just don't believe it really. I don't think it's likely. I can't see any scenario under which it would happen. And I suspect the British, being what they are, if you ask them a second time, they will probably, simply because they were annoyed at being asked, reply with the same answer. I think you can see that, I mean, there is the argument that Tony Blair, John Major and others are making, which is when people see what the deal is on offer, begin to get a sense of the impact of leaving the European Union, they might change their minds and they should be given an opportunity to express that change of mind. I just don't think the phasing allows for it. I just don't think the timing allows for it. And I'm pretty convinced that the government, current government, will arrange things so that the timing does not allow for it. And I certainly, when I report back to Brussels, I try and persuade them not to think about a second referendum, to assume it's not going to happen.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Mike.
In this office, there are two with the council, children, Scotland and Northern Ireland. What's the future for Scotland and what about the hard or soft border in Ireland?
So to take Scotland first, it seems to me the policy of the Scottish Government at present is directed towards influencing the Westminster Government to go for a soft Brexit. I've heard Nicola Sturgeon say Scotland has a very clear view that its interests would be best served by remaining in the European Union, but failing that, remaining within the single market. And they also accept, I think, that the negotiation will be carried out by the Westminster Government. So Plan A is to ensure that the Westminster Government takes a line which reflects Scotland's interests and ambitions. Plan B is to consider whether it's possible to have a differentiated arrangement so that Scotland remained within the single market and England and Wales didn't. And apparently they've been doing a lot of creative thinking about this and are about to table a paper suggesting how it might be done. We'll see. I find it very difficult to see how you can have a country which is not formally a federal country, where foreign policy is decided in Westminster, how you could have a differentiated solution. And particularly, if you have a customs border there, it becomes very difficult. And we haven't had a hard border between Scotland and England for, well, I'm not quite sure how long. Historians would be a better place to say. So I think there is also the possibility, and I'm sure that the First Minister is contemplating this, that if neither Plan A nor Plan B should materialise, then Plan C is to ask for a second independence referendum. Will she win it? I don't know. If you listen to Mrs. Sturgeon, she says there are people who voted no last time, and they voted no to independence because they were told that the best way to keep Scotland in the European Union was to remain within the United Kingdom. Now, clearly that argument would no longer hold good in this scenario. Whether everybody who voted in Scotland to remain in the European Union, which they did overwhelmingly, would subsequently vote for independence, I don't think you can read it across that way either. And obviously, as Quebec found, you can have 2 goes at an independence referendum, you can't really have 3. Once you've had 2 rejections, that kind of puts the question to bed. So that's Scotland, I think. Ireland is a much more complicated case. Ireland is going to be one of only 2 land borders. People forget Gibraltar is not a land border between the UK and a member state. But Ireland is a very clear border between what will be the European Union and the country which is outside the European Union. And there are obviously historical, political overtones to reinstating any form of hard border. Both the Republic and the United Kingdom would want to seek to avoid that. For economic reasons, I think there are 30,000 people who cross it every day just to go to work. And 80%, I think it is, of Irish exports go to the United Kingdom, not necessarily to the north, but to the United Kingdom. The example of Norway and Sweden exists. Norway is outside the customs union, but it accepts free movement of persons and it's inside the Schengen arrangements. So people move back and forward between Norway and Sweden without any border checks or passport controls. In terms of customs, they do random controls. They basically assume that businesses on both sides of the border are honest, correctly fill out the customs documentation. And maybe that's part of the kind of Nordic environment. And whether you could make the same assumption in the case of Ireland, I don't know. We know that smuggling was part of the way in which the paramilitaries financed their activities in the past, so there is a history of smuggling across that border. And of course, once you get differentials in terms of currency, in terms of customs, in terms of excise duty, there's an incentive to move goods back and forwards illicitly. Nobody, as far as I know, has found an answer to that problem yet. There's some talk about using the Internet of Things, putting chips in consignment so you can track them. Whether that's a practical solution or not, I don't know.
Take questions.
Well, again, the ball is first of all in the UK, UK's court. The European Investment Bank is an institution of the European Union, although it's not a political institution. And you could argue that it's in the mutual interest of both parties to retain that stake. The UK withdraws its capital, it is almost certain that the European Investment Bank would lose its AAA rating, simply because it's such a chunk of capital coming out. The shock would be enormous in terms of its lending activities. But it's one part of the European Union that the UK has always looked quite favourably on in terms of its activities. And it might be a way of maintaining this very close relationship without being involved in the political institutions that one hears British politicians talk about. But again, the first proposal, the first move has to come from the UK.
It was expected the Supreme Court upholds our High Court ruling, and it goes to Parliament. It's not a Conservative manifesto, so with the House of Lords being able to debate it, and with a very small Conservative majority on it, there's everything to suggest that it can be thwarted one way or another. Keeping away from the possibility of a general election being mooted, Parliament Act and all those complications, where do you see an objective role being taken to actually bring about Brexit without it being pushed further and further into almost long runs?
So, again, this is more British politics than European. I think the government's intention is, as I say, to bring forward a very short bill almost immediately after the Supreme Court gives its ruling, and the Supreme Court is expected to rule early in the new year. The aim of the short bill, as I understand it, is to prevent it being too amendable. The rules apparently are that you cannot put down an amendment which would negate the whole purpose of the bill. So if you have a short bill, it's quite difficult to amend it without negating the purpose of the bill. You can add to it, and you can add conditions, and I'm sure in the House of Lords at least they will find clever ways to do that. Different people count differently in the Commons, but the assumption is that the government will maintain its majority in the Commons. On the Conservative side, it's quite difficult now to find anyone who is still a Remainer. There are some, but there aren't many. So they may lose maximum 30 Conservatives, I would say, from the government side. The SNP will probably vote against. Labour will be divided, I think. There will be quite a number of Labour MPs who will vote for triggering Article 50. So I don't see it as a way of blocking Article 50 in the Commons. The Lords is a more difficult situation to predict. Not in the manifesto, it doesn't benefit from the Parliament Act, therefore. On the other hand, I think the freezing of House of Lords reform sends a fairly clear message to their lordships. If you mess up our timetable, we have the means of retaliation, i.e. radical reform of the upper house. So, two scenarios. One is they delay it, but they delay it for a month or so. And they add interesting amendments. So amendments in terms of reporting, in terms of monitoring, maybe in terms of the eventual outcome. The other is that they do seek to exercise their full powers of revision, and then they could block it for at least a year. Now that would be a very brave thing, as Sir Humphrey might say, for their lordships to do, and I think the prediction in Whitehall is they won't. So I think what they may well do is add these conditions. Now whether that conditions as to procedure, they could demand, for example, that the government bring forth a green paper or a white paper before triggering Article 15. They could demand undertakings in terms of reporting. They could add substantive conditions in terms of the desired outcome, membership of the single market, remaining within the customs union, close cooperation on justice and home affairs, continuing relationship on security and foreign policy. They could do all of those things. I don't know what they're going to do. I hear rumours from different members of the House of Lords, but whether they're organised enough to have a shared view, I don't know.
To what extent do you see the remaining EU members changing their relations for the next couple of years? In particular, change the relationship between people, the relations of France and Germany, basis, looking at some of those two programs this year. There may well be a very different landscape.
Absolutely. So I think in order we have the Italian referendum, the Austrian the Austrian presidential rerun, and then the Netherlands, France, Germany. So a lot of big elections coming. If Le Pen wins in France, all bets are off. Frankly, I think if she were to win, that might well spell the end of the European Union. It would be such a unmanageable, dramatic change. I don't know how the European Union would cope with that. But if she doesn't, if we can expect Monsieur Fillon to win that, my view is that changes to free movement will not be of a nature that is fundamental. It won't be what the English, the British, well actually mainly the English, but and the Welsh, read about when they talk, when they read about a change of heart. If you look at what Mrs. Merkel, for example, says about free movement, which often gets reported in the newspapers here as all the others are thinking about free movement and they're coming around to the British point of view that there should be far more restrictions, limitations on it. What Mrs. Merkel is primarily talking about is the social security aspect, the kinds of things that David Cameron was negotiating with his counterparts about back in February. The Germans and most of the other member states do not have a problem with the principle of free movement. For many member states, it has an enormous symbolic significance, because in many member states they have experienced a time when they were not free to move beyond their national boundaries. Not just the Central and Eastern Europeans, but if you think about the Greeks, the Spanish, the Portuguese, within living memory there have been authoritarian regimes there that made it very difficult for their people to move. So it has symbolic impact. And in most, obviously, the Eastern Europeans have taken advantage of free movement, many of them to come to the West, not only, by the way, to the United Kingdom. There are an awful lot of people from Eastern Europe in Germany. There are more Romanians in Italy than there are in the United Kingdom. We tend to see it, the UK tends to see it through a very Anglo-centric perspective. So I don't think that that is going to change. There are other things that might change. I think economic policy, for example, may be subject to a more fundamental review. We've already seen a slight loosening of the kind of what is loosely labelled austerity. There may be other changes, but I don't think free movement is going to be sort of hived off, sliced out of the four freedoms. Is that no?
Would it be true to say that there are two major ways of dealing with
Yes. Well, the third one is the WTO, not having any form of agreement with the European Union. I would say there's a kind of continuum, because you can say that the EA, the Norway model, is essentially full membership of the single market, and the single market is very broadly defined. Essentially, all that's left out of it, a common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, and you're outside the customs union, which allows you to, in theory, enter into your own agreements with other countries outside the European Union. In fact, what Norway does is always enter into the same agreements as have been signed by the European Union. They just kind of reproduce them in facsimile fashion. So it's a kind of illusory freedom in terms of third country trade. But once you get beyond the EEA agreement, the Norway model, you have a sort of range of association agreements. So there's Canada, but there's Switzerland, there's Ukraine, famously there's Albania. And once you start negotiating, the only requirements the WTO places on a free trade agreement is that it has to be comprehensive. You can't just have free trade in cars, for example. You've got to have free trade covering almost the entirety of your economy. You can have some exceptions. Hive off agriculture, for example, not have free trade in that. So it has to be fairly comprehensive. But then there's a question about what you do in relation to services, for example. Very few of the free trade agreements that the European Union has. This is true of Switzerland, it's true of Canada, it's true of the proposed agreement with the US, cover services to any great degree. And obviously that's important for the United Kingdom, which is now a service-based economy. So you might want something. Again, the Prime Minister says she wants a custom-made agreement, something tailored to suit the UK. You might want something that is a bit less than the Norway arrangement, but considerably more than the Canada or the Swiss arrangement. How you do that whilst keeping your two red lines, the two red lines I spoke about, free movement of persons, control over free movement of persons, and getting out of the jurisdiction of the European Court, I don't know.
Yeah, you mentioned the deadline in March. I've heard about that before, only from unreliable sources, of which there are very many. Could you explain what it actually is?
The deadline in March, well, the Prime Minister keeps talking about the end of March. They think she's an unreliable source. So the deadline, which is a self-imposed deadline now from the United Kingdom, is that they will give notification under Article 50 by the end of March. Article 50 says there are 2 years in which the withdrawal agreement can be concluded. In the course of that time, those 2 years have to include the time necessary for the European Parliament to consider, to debate, and to give its approval. So in Brussels they say, well, it's not actually 2 years, you have to chop off 2 or 3 months at the end for the European Parliament, you have to chop off 2 or 3 months at the beginning for the 27 to get their act together and decide upon a negotiating mandate. And the other thing you really clearly want to do is not butt up against the next European elections in May 2019, because it would be pointless, the UK going through the motions of electing their MEPs in order to withdraw from the European Union 2 or 3 months later. The 2-year period can be extended, but it has to be extended unanimously. So all 27 member states and the UK would have to agree to an extension, which in the view of many commentators makes it unlikely. You only have one member state who is holding everybody else over a barrel in order to get what they want out of negotiation.
Natural within the Parliament.
And it could be, it could be the Walloon Parliament. So I think 2 years is probably the maximum. It's not the minimum, and there are voices in Brussels saying actually we want to do it much more quickly than the 2 years. It's going to be complicated is all I can say, and we come back to the elections and whether the other member states will be ready to get to the end game any quicker than the 2 years. The one thing I didn't say was, if we go for a free trade agreement, if the EU and the UK together go for a free trade agreement, that will be unanimous probably, as it was for the CETA, the Canadian. So whereas you have qualified majority voting for the withdrawal, you can disregard 1 or 2 member states, get around the awkward parade. You can't do that for the free trade agreement. It would be unanimous. It would also probably, like CETA, have to go to the Walloon Parliament, all of the parliaments of the member states. Well, I think it comes back to the unanimity point. So any single member state can stamp its foot and say, I don't want to extend this process. And then what the treaty says, 2 years on, the treaty ceases to apply and utter chaos breaks out. The rules stop applying in the United Kingdom, except what we might have done unilaterally with the Great Repeal Bill. Nobody knows what they're entitled to in terms of payments. The EU wouldn't know what it was entitled to claim from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom wouldn't know what it was entitled to claim back. And one of the tricky issues is that the rebate, the UK budget rebate, is paid, so the budget rebate that is paid this year, 2016, is based on the 2015 accounts. So the UK doesn't know what it's going to get back by way of rebate until the year N plus 1. Now, if you have kind of brutal full stop, the rebate also is left sort of mid-air. So I think everybody wants to avoid, if possible, that kind of disorderly, chaotic exit, which would be very damaging to business. The uncertainty that that would create in terms of validity of contracts, not knowing what the status of their employees was, not knowing whether they could continue to do business under authorisations. Nobody would want that to happen, I suspect. But accidents happen in politics. Things can go wrong without anybody wanting them to. Time runs out, and the rules change.
Thank you. And actually, talking about time runs out, that links in very nicely to... no, I'm afraid, because of the time we've got to be out of the hall, I've got to sort of be strict on time and allow a few minutes for people to ask their questions individually at the end of this. But for the purposes of the meeting as it stands and for the recording, I'm afraid we do have to call it to a halt there. Can I thank you once again, Jacqueline, for joining us. It's been fascinating listening and also in some ways depressing. Thank you both. different options that are coming up, but it's the reality of the situation we live in, and I think it's useful to have these conversations and to get involved in the debate and to talk to everybody else about the problems that are coming up, because it's going to take an awful lot of heads putting together to actually sort out some of these issues. And while we're still recording, I just wanted to also say a thank you to Jonathan Webber, who was actually the person who put the bid together to the EU for these debates in the first place, and unfortunately didn't live to see them happen, but was a good friend, and I'd like to say thank you to Jonathan from all of us, because it's been a wonderful evening, and the debates across the West Midlands have done a very good job, that he was very keen to have the conversations carrying on, and I'm hoping there will be a lot more conversations that go on in the future. Thank you.